When protocol becomes a weapon, the marble corridors of the Hague International Peace Center had witnessed countless diplomatic earthquakes, but nothing quite like this. At precisely 2:47 p.m. on a gray March afternoon, the carefully orchestrated symphony of international relations hit a discordant note that would reverberate across every newsroom, embassy, and social media platform on the planet. Mr. Zelensky, you belong at the side table, not the main one. Serious negotiations are for serious players. The words hung in the crystalline air like a verbal guillotine. Donald Trump, 47th President of the United States, had just delivered what would become known as the most shocking protocol violation in modern diplomatic history. The statement, made with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to reshaping reality through sheer audacity, struck the assembled diplomatic corps like lightning hitting a powder keg. Volodymyr Zelensky stood motionless in the ornate reception hall, his characteristic green attire suddenly seeming to blend with the pale marble walls around him. For a man who had spent 3 years commanding global attention through crisis after crisis, this moment of forced invisibility was more devastating than any military setback. His dark eyes, which had stared down generals and heads of state, now reflected something between disbelief and steel-cold calculation. The silence stretched for exactly 11 seconds. In diplomatic time, that was an eternity. Camera shutters clicked like machine gun fire as photographers sensed history unfolding. The assembled crowd of world leaders, seasoned diplomats, and international media representatives collectively held their breath, waiting for the explosion that surely must follow such an unprecedented breach of protocol. But the explosion never came. Instead, something far more unsettling occurred. Zelensky simply nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped back into the shadows of the reception hall's periphery. His face revealed nothing, but those who knew him well enough recognized the telltale tightening around his eyes, not anger, but the kind of focused intensity that preceded his most devastating political maneuvers. Ladies and gentlemen, the voice of CNN's chief international correspondent cut through the tension like a razor. We are witnessing what can only be described as a diplomatic earthquake. In an unprecedented move, President Trump has just publicly excluded Ukraine's President Zelensky from the main NATO security discussions. Within minutes, the story had exploded across every major news platform. The BBC interrupted regular programming with a breaking news alert. France 24 scrambled their top political analysts. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags that would trend for weeks. Hashtag protocolgate, hashtag diplomatic shock, and perhaps most cutting of all, hashtag children's table. But the real drama was unfolding in the hushed conversations and frantic phone calls taking place in the elegant side chambers of the conference center. Emmanuel Macron, president of France, had gone visibly pale upon hearing Trump's announcement. His aide whispered urgently in his ear as he stepped away from the receiving line, his usual diplomatic composure cracking like ice under pressure. "Get me Chancellor Scholz immediately," he hissed into his secure phone. "This is a catastrophe for alliance unity." 3 floors above in the German delegation's private suite, Olaf Scholz was already fielding his own crisis calls. Neen, this was not discussed in any preliminary meetings, he explained to his foreign minister, his typically measured tone betraying an edge of panic. This is Trump operating completely outside established channels. The European Union's chief diplomat, a seasoned veteran of countless international crises, was seen pacing frantically in the building's famous Rose Garden, gesticulating wildly during what appeared to be a heated phone conversation with Brussels. Every few seconds, he would glance back toward the main building as if watching for signs of further diplomatic explosions. Meanwhile, in the American delegation's war room, a spacious suite overlooking the historic Peace Palace, Trump's team was orchestrating what could only be described as a systematic demolition of traditional diplomatic protocol. Charts and seating arrangements were being redrawn in real time. The main conference room, designed to accommodate 31 NATO member nations around a magnificent oval table crafted from European oak, was being reconfigured to pointedly exclude one very specific chair. "Sir, the European delegations are requesting emergency consultations," reported Trump's chief of staff, a thin man whose perpetually worried expression had only intensified since arriving in The Hague. "They're concerned about the messaging this sends to who?" Trump interrupted, not looking up from the revised seating chart he was reviewing. "To Putin? Good. Let him see that we don't waste time on endless committees and photo opportunities. 3 years of meetings, 3 years of speeches, 3 years of absolutely nothing. Sometimes you need to clear the deck to get real work done." The psychological profile of Donald Trump in this moment was fascinating to observe. Here was a man who had built an empire on the principle that every negotiation was ultimately about power dynamics, that every relationship could be reduced to winners and losers. His decision to sideline Zelensky wasn't born from malice. It was the calculated move of a businessman who believed that removing emotional complications would lead to more efficient outcomes. "The media is calling it a humiliation," ventured his press secretary, scrolling through the flood of international coverage on her tablet. "The imagery of the empty chair is already going viral." "Let them call it whatever they want," Trump replied, his trademark confidence unshaken. "When I broker a peace deal in the next 48 hours that every previous administration failed to achieve in 3 years, they'll understand the method behind the madness." But even as Trump projected absolute certainty, his advisors could detect the subtle signs of a man calculating rapidly shifting variables. His fingers drummed unconsciously on the mahogany desk, a tell that appeared whenever he was processing multiple strategic scenarios simultaneously. He had expected outrage from the Europeans, criticism from the media, and protests from various diplomatic quarters. What he hadn't anticipated was the complete silence from the man he had just publicly dismissed. For miles away, in his modest hotel suite, Zelensky sat in a leather chair by the window, staring out at The Hague's historic skyline. His security detail had been quietly doubled, though whether this was due to legitimate threats or simply the uncertainty that followed diplomatic scandals, no one could say. His chief of staff, a brilliant woman who had navigated every crisis of his presidency, stood nearby reviewing the cascade of international phone calls flooding their communications center. "Mr. President, we have requests for statements from 43 news organizations, emergency consultations from 7 EU leaders, and 3 separate offers of alternative meeting venues," she reported, her voice carefully neutral despite the chaos swirling around them. "How would you like to respond?" Zelensky continued staring out the window for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the emotion one might expect from a leader who had just been publicly humiliated on the world stage. "Schedule nothing for the next 6 hours," he said quietly. "Cancel all media requests. Inform our European colleagues that we appreciate their concern but require time to consider our options." His chief of staff blinked in surprise. In 3 years of crisis management, she had never seen her president choose silence over immediate response. Zelensky was known for his quick wit, his ability to turn any slight into a rhetorical victory, his instinct to fight back twice as hard when cornered. This strategic withdrawal was completely unprecedented. "Sir, with respect, every minute we delay gives Trump's narrative more time to solidify. The longer we remain silent, the more it appears we're accepting his characterization of what." Zelensky turned from the window, and for the first time that day, allowed a slight smile to cross his features. "Of being relegated to the children's table? Let me ask you something. When a chess grandmaster makes an unexpected move, do you assume he's made a mistake? Or do you wait to see how the game develops?" Back at the Peace Center, the physical manifestation of Trump's decision was taking shape with brutal efficiency. The main conference hall, an architectural masterpiece designed to inspire cooperation and equality among nations, was being transformed into a stark visual representation of inclusion and exclusion. The grand oval table, polished to mirror perfection, now featured 30 seats arranged with mathematical precision. Each position was marked with the flag of a NATO member nation, each chair positioned to ensure perfect sight lines and equal status among participants. But it was the adjacent smaller room that told the real story. Here, a circular table had been arranged for what the official schedule euphemistically termed parallel consultations. The guest list for this secondary gathering read like a diplomatic island of the excluded: representatives from partner nations, observers from international organizations, and various diplomatic spouses who traditionally attended such events for purely ceremonial purposes. The symbolism was as sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. While the powerful debated the future of European security around their table of equals, the sidelined would make polite conversation over catered refreshments in what amounted to a very expensive waiting room. European journalists, veterans of countless international summits, were struggling to find historical precedents for such a dramatic breach of established protocol. "In 40 years of covering international relations," observed the BBC's senior diplomatic correspondent, "I have never witnessed such a calculated humiliation of a sitting head of state." The closest parallel might be the various snubs during the Cold War, but even then, the exclusions were expected given the broader geopolitical context. The French delegation's reaction provided perhaps the most telling insight into how Europe viewed this unprecedented situation. President Macron, known for his careful diplomatic language, abandoned all pretense of diplomatic speak when cornered by reporters. "What we are witnessing is not just a breach of protocol," he stated, his usual composure cracking slightly. "It is a fundamental misunderstanding of how democratic alliances function. You cannot simply exclude voices because they complicate your preferred narrative." German Chancellor Scholz, characteristically more measured but equally troubled, offered his own perspective. "Effective diplomacy requires including all stakeholders in meaningful dialogue. When we begin picking and choosing who deserves a seat at the table based on expedience rather than principle, we undermine the very foundations of international cooperation." But perhaps the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. A joint statement from the Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, carried a weight that transcended their relatively modest size on the global stage. "If today it is Ukraine being relegated to the sidelines," the statement read, "who among us can be certain we will not face similar treatment tomorrow?" The principle of equal sovereignty among nations is not negotiable, regardless of the current crisis any nation may face. As afternoon shadows lengthened across The Hague's historic streets, the international community found itself grappling with questions that extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic crisis. Social media platforms buzzed with amateur analysis and professional commentary, creating a real-time global conversation about power, respect, and the unwritten rules that govern international relations. #diplomatic crisis became the #1 trending topic across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. TikTok videos analyzing the situation garnered millions of views within hours. University international relations professors found themselves inundated with interview requests as news organizations scrambled to provide context for a situation that seemed to have no clear precedent. Yet through it all, the man at the center of the storm remained mysteriously absent from the commentary. While diplomats debated, journalists analyzed, and social media erupted, Volodymyr Zelensky maintained a silence that grew more intriguing with each passing hour. His hotel suite had become an impromptu command center, with secure communication lines buzzing constantly as allies, partners, and curious observers sought to understand his strategy. But to each inquiry, his team provided the same response. The president was considering his options and would address the situation in due course. The evening's protocol dinner, originally planned as an elegant precursor to the main negotiations, had transformed into something resembling a diplomatic minefield. Seating arrangements that had been carefully negotiated weeks in advance suddenly carried the weight of international statements. Where would Zelensky be placed? How would other leaders interact with him? Would anyone risk Trump's displeasure by showing too much support for the excluded president? As the sun set over The Hague, casting long shadows across the Peace Center's gardens, the stage was set for an evening that would either see the normalization of a new, harsher form of international relations, or witness one of the most remarkable diplomatic comebacks in modern history. The chess game had begun, but the Grandmaster's next move remained hidden behind a mask of calculated silence. In the world of high-stakes diplomacy, sometimes the most powerful weapon was not what you said, but what you deliberately chose not to say, at least, not yet. The dinner bell would ring in 3 hours. The world would be watching. And somewhere in a hotel room overlooking the city where nations came to settle their differences, a president sat quietly, planning his response to being relegated to the children's table of international relations. The opening gambit had been played. The countermove was coming. When dignity becomes stronger than protocol, the Grand Ballroom of the Hague International Peace Center had hosted kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, dictators and democrats. Its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers had witnessed the signing of peace treaties, the declaration of wars, and countless moments that shaped the trajectory of human history. But nothing in its illustrious past had prepared it for the theatrical drama that was about to unfold on this March evening. At exactly 7:30 p.m., as the last notes of the European Union anthem faded into the ornate acoustics of the ballroom, 200 of the world's most powerful individuals took their assigned seats for what was supposed to be a routine protocol dinner. The seating arrangement, however, told a story that no amount of diplomatic language could disguise. The main table, a magnificent oval of polished mahogany that had been crafted specifically for such occasions, commanded the center of the room like a throne. Here sat the titans of the Western world, Trump at the position of honor, flanked by the leaders of Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and other NATO powerhouses. The conversation flowed easily between discussions of trade agreements, military procurement, and the kind of casual power brokering that occurred when the world's decision-makers gathered in one place. But it was the smaller, round table position near the room's elegant windows that captured the attention of every diplomat, journalist, and observer present. This secondary table, officially designated for distinguished guests and accompanying delegations, had become the most watched piece of furniture in international relations. Volodymyr Zelensky sat between Margaret Sinclair, wife of the Canadian Prime Minister, and Dr. Elena Kask, Estonia's Minister of Cultural Affairs. The visual symbolism was devastating in its clarity. The leader of a nation fighting for its survival, seated among ceremonial guests whose primary function was to smile graciously and make pleasant conversation about art and literature. For the first 20 minutes of the dinner, Zelensky spoke not a single word. This was not the behavior anyone had expected from a man known for his quick wit and rhetorical agility. European intelligence services had spent considerable resources analyzing his psychological profile, and every assessment pointed to the same conclusion. When cornered, Zelensky fought back harder and more creatively than any contemporary political leader. His silence was more unsettling than any angry outburst could have been. Margaret Sinclair, a gracious woman accustomed to the delicate art of diplomatic conversation, made several gentle attempts to engage the Ukrainian president in discussion. "The spring tulips in Holland are truly magnificent this time of year," she offered, gesturing toward the windows where the last light of day illuminated the Peace Center's famous gardens. Zelensky nodded politely and returned his attention to the untouched plate before him. Dr. Kask, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the situation, tried a different approach. "Mr. President, Estonia has always admired Ukraine's cultural resilience during challenging times. Perhaps you could share your thoughts on how the arts continue to flourish even during periods of international crisis?" Again, a polite nod. Again, silence. At the main table, the conversation had shifted to more substantial matters. Trump was in his element, regaling his fellow leaders with stories of successful negotiations and business deals that had seemed impossible until his direct intervention. "The key," he explained, gesturing with his fork for emphasis, "is knowing when to walk away from a bad deal. Sometimes you have to clear the table completely before you can set it properly." Chancellor Scholz, ever the diplomat, chose his words carefully. "Of course, Donald, though one must consider whether clearing the table might also remove essential elements necessary for a comprehensive solution." Essential elements? Trump's voice carried just enough edge to make the surrounding conversations pause. "Olaf, I've seen essential elements drag out negotiations for years with no results. Sometimes efficiency requires difficult choices." President Macron, who had been notably quiet throughout the dinner, finally spoke up. "The question, perhaps, is whether we measure success by speed of resolution or by sustainability of outcomes." The exchange was taking place in the polite, coded language of international diplomacy, but everyone present understood they were witnessing a fundamental philosophical debate about how democracies should approach crisis resolution. The European perspective, shaped by centuries of complex negotiations and multilateral cooperation, stood in stark contrast to the American approach of decisive, unilateral action. But the most electric tension in the room emanated from that smaller table by the windows, where one of the world's most watched political figures continued his unprecedented silence. International journalists, positioned at carefully designated observation points around the ballroom's perimeter, were filing real-time reports that were being broadcast across the globe. "The image we're seeing here is absolutely extraordinary," whispered the BBC's diplomatic correspondent into her microphone. "President Zelensky has not spoken a single word in 23 minutes. For a leader known for his powerful oratory, this silence is becoming the story of the evening." CNN's cameras, operating under strict protocol guidelines, captured wide shots of the ballroom that emphasized the stark contrast between the animated discussions at the main table and the subdued atmosphere at the secondary seating arrangement. Social media was already buzzing with speculation about Zelensky's strategy, with hashtags like #PowerfulSilence and #DignifiedProtest trending globally. At the main table, Trump was warming to one of his favorite topics, the art of the deal in international relations. "Look at what I accomplished with North Korea in my first term," he explained, his confidence growing with each word. Previous administrations spent decades getting nowhere with endless meetings and photo opportunities. "I got results because I was willing to try something completely different." "And yet," interjected the British Prime Minister with characteristic understatement, Some might argue that sustainable diplomacy requires building consensus rather than bypassing it. Consensus is important, Trump agreed, but consensus for the sake of consensus is just another word for paralysis. Sometimes leadership means making the hard choices that others are too afraid to make. The philosophical battle lines were being drawn with increasing clarity. On one side, efficiency, decisive action, and the belief that strong leadership required the willingness to override traditional procedures. On the other, process, inclusion, and the conviction that lasting solutions emerged only through comprehensive dialogue that honored all stakeholders. But as these theoretical debates played out at the main table, something far more dramatic was building at the secondary seating arrangement. Zelensky had finished exactly 3 bites of his dinner. His water glass remained full. His eyes had not once glanced toward the main table where his exclusion was being discussed in barely veiled terms. Instead, he seemed to be studying something beyond the windows, perhaps the illuminated peace monument that stood in the center of the building's courtyard, or perhaps something visible only to himself. At 8:47 p.m., after 57 minutes of absolute silence, Volodymyr Zelensky slowly pushed back his chair and stood. The sound of the chair moving across the polished floor was barely audible, but its effect on the room was instantaneous and electric. Conversations didn't just pause, they stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the man who had been relegated to the diplomatic equivalent of a children's table but who now commanded the attention of everyone present through sheer force of presence. Zelensky stood quietly for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. He was not a tall man, but in that instant, he seemed to fill the entire ballroom. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 20, then 30. Camera flashes flickered like distant lightning as photographers recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the vast room without any amplification. It was not loud, but it possessed the kind of quiet intensity that demanded absolute attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his English accented but crystal clear, "I want to thank the Netherlands for hosting us this evening in this beautiful and historic venue." He paused, allowing his eyes to sweep across the room, making brief contact with leaders, diplomats, and journalists alike. "But I must share something with all of you tonight." Another pause. The room had become so quiet that the distant sound of traffic outside seemed unnaturally loud. "While we enjoy this magnificent dinner in this place dedicated to peace, 300 kilometers from here, children are falling asleep in subway stations and basement shelters. Not because they are seeking adventure or playing games, but because they want to live until tomorrow morning." The words landed like physical blows. Several European leaders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. At the main table, Trump had stopped eating and was watching Zelensky with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Tonight, while we debate seating arrangements and protocol procedures, mothers in Kharkiv are singing lullabies to their children underground. While we discuss the efficiency of various negotiation strategies, teachers in Mariupol are conducting classes by candlelight in bomb shelters." Zelensky's voice never rose above conversational level, but its emotional weight seemed to grow with each sentence. He was not shouting or pleading. He was simply stating facts with the kind of quiet authority that came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "I understand that I am not seated at tomorrow's main table. I understand that some believe serious negotiations require only serious players." His eyes found Trump's across the room. "But I would submit to you that Ukrainian soldiers defending their homeland at this very moment are seated at the most serious table of all, the table where the future of democratic values is being decided not with words, but with blood and sacrifice." The French delegation had gone completely still. President Macron was staring at Zelensky with an expression of growing admiration. Chancellor Scholz had put down his fork entirely, his full attention focused on the man who was transforming a diplomatic dinner into something approaching a moral reckoning. 3 years ago, many in this room promised that Ukraine would never stand alone. Tonight, I sit at a table with the spouse of a distinguished prime minister and a very accomplished minister of cultural affairs, both wonderful people who honor me with their company. But the message is clear. When the most crucial decisions about European security are being made, Ukraine's voice is considered optional. A murmur ran through the assembled journalists. This was no longer a diplomatic dinner. It was becoming a historic moment that would be analyzed in international relations textbooks for decades to come. "President Trump, you have spoken tonight about the importance of making difficult choices and the value of decisive action. I agree completely. So let me make a difficult choice right now, and take decisive action. The entire room seemed to lean forward as one. Even the serving staff had stopped moving, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. I am ready for serious talks. I have been ready since the first day this crisis began. But serious talks require serious partners, partners who are willing to discuss genuine peace rather than cosmetic surrenders, partners who understand that some things cannot be negotiated away, partners who recognize that the price of freedom is not measured in convenience but in principle. Zelensky's voice carried a note of steel now, though he remained completely calm and controlled. When Russia is ready to engage in talks about actual peace rather than ultimatums disguised as negotiations, Ukraine will be there. We will be ready to discuss security guarantees, reconstruction frameworks, humanitarian corridors, and every other element necessary for a sustainable resolution. He paused again, this time allowing his gaze to move slowly around the room, making eye contact with as many leaders as possible. But we will not be ready to discuss the surrender of our territory, the abandonment of our people, or the normalization of aggression as a tool of international relations. These things are not negotiable, regardless of how much more convenient their acceptance might make for efficient deal-making. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. This was not just a speech, it was a direct challenge to the most powerful man in the room, delivered with such calm dignity that it was impossible to dismiss as emotional grandstanding. I thank you all for your attention, Zelensky concluded, and I thank President Trump for reminding me tonight that sometimes the most important conversations happen not at the main table, but wherever principled people are willing to speak truth about what they value most. He remained standing for another moment, his hands still resting on the back of his chair, his expression serene but unwavering. The silence in the room was so complete that the sound of a single person beginning to clap seemed as loud as thunder. That person was Donald Trump. The American president had risen from his seat at the main table and was applauding slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on Zelensky with what could only be described as grudging respect. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything the room had anticipated, that for several seconds no one else moved. Then, as if a dam had burst, the entire ballroom erupted in applause. European leaders rose from their seats, journalists abandoned their professional neutrality, and even the serving staff joined in what became a sustained ovation that lasted for more than 2 minutes. But throughout it all, the two men who had defined the evening's drama, Trump still standing at the main table, Zelensky still positioned by the windows, maintained eye contact across the room. It was a moment of mutual recognition between two leaders who had fundamentally different approaches to power, but who understood strength when they saw it. When the applause finally faded and the room began to return to some semblance of normal diplomatic behavior, one thing had become absolutely clear. The evening's protocol dinner had become something unprecedented in modern international relations. A man who had been excluded from the main table had just delivered the main table speech. A leader who had been relegated to ceremonial status had just commanded the attention and respect of the world's most powerful assembly. As guests began to circulate and engage in the post-dinner conversations that were traditionally used to conduct the real business of international summits, the questions on everyone's mind were no longer about seating arrangements or protocol procedures. Instead, they were asking themselves what they had just witnessed, what it meant for the future of international diplomacy, and what would happen when these two strong-willed leaders finally sat down to talk face-to-face. The chess game had taken an unexpected turn. The Grandmaster had made his move, and now the entire world was waiting to see how his opponent would respond. When enemies become allies, the Moonlight Terrace of the Hague International Peace Center was designed for quiet contemplation, not political earthquakes. Overlooking the historic city's evening skyline, this secluded outdoor space had served as a retreat for countless diplomats seeking respite from the intensity of international negotiations. Tonight, however, it would witness one of the most extraordinary private conversations in modern diplomatic history. At 10:47 p.m., exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes after Volodymyr Zelensky's speech had transformed the evening's protocol dinner into a moral reckoning, Donald Trump stepped onto the terrace alone. No security detail, no aides, no carefully positioned cameras to document the moment for posterity. For the first time in years, the most powerful man in the world had chosen to operate without the protective bubble that typically surrounded him. The March evening was crisp but not cold, with a light breeze carrying the faint scent of early spring flowers from the Peace Center's famous gardens. Overhead, a nearly full moon cast silver light across the terrace's elegant stone balustrade, creating an almost theatrical setting for what was about to unfold. Trump had been processing the evening's events with the calculating mind of a man who had spent decades evaluating human behavior for strategic advantage. Zelensky's speech had not just impressed him. It had fundamentally altered his assessment of the Ukrainian leader's capabilities. This was not the desperate politician clinging to power that his briefing materials had described. This was something far more dangerous and valuable, a genuine leader operating from unshakable principles. The sound of footsteps on stone announced Zelensky's arrival. He emerged from the terrace's entrance with the same quiet dignity he had displayed throughout the evening, his characteristic green jacket now complemented by the moonlight that seemed to highlight the determined set of his shoulders. He had accepted Trump's invitation for this private meeting without hesitation, though his advisors had spent 30 minutes debating the wisdom of such an encounter. For a moment, the two men stood on opposite sides of the terrace, separated by perhaps 20 feet of moonlit stone and 3 years of geopolitical tension. The silence stretched between them, not the uncomfortable quiet of uncertainty, but the measured pause of two experienced negotiators taking each other's measure. Trump spoke first, his voice carrying none of the bombastic confidence that typically characterized his public statements. That was quite a speech, Volodymyr. Quite a speech indeed. Zelensky remained perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that managed to convey both respect and readiness. Thank you, Mr. President. Though I should clarify, I was not seeking applause. I was seeking understanding. Understanding, Trump repeated, moving closer to the terrace's central fountain, a modest but elegant piece featuring carved doves that had been installed to commemorate the Peace Center's founding. In my experience, most politicians seek applause first, and understanding maybe never. You did something different tonight. Perhaps because I am not most politicians, Zelensky replied, finally moving from his position near the entrance to join Trump near the fountain. The circumstances of my presidency have not afforded me the luxury of conventional political behavior. The proximity allowed each man to study the other with the kind of close attention impossible in public settings. Trump saw the signs of a leader who had aged years in the span of months, the slight lines around Zelensky's eyes, the careful way he held his shoulders, the unconscious alertness of someone who had grown accustomed to crisis as a constant companion. But he also saw something else, an unshakable core of conviction that reminded him, uncomfortably, of himself at moments when everything was on the line. Zelensky, for his part, observed a Donald Trump he had never seen in public or private meetings. Gone was the larger-than-life persona that dominated every room he entered. In its place was a man who seemed to be genuinely wrestling with complex calculations, weighing variables that extended far beyond immediate political advantage. You know, Trump continued, settling into one of the terrace's wrought iron chairs and gesturing for Zelensky to join him. I've been thinking about what you said in there. About serious partners and serious talks. And what conclusions have you reached? Zelensky asked, taking the offered seat but maintaining perfect posture, his attention completely focused on the conversation. That maybe I've been approaching this whole situation like a real estate deal when it's actually something more complicated, Trump admitted, a rare moment of introspection from a man not known for public self-doubt. In business, you can walk away from any negotiation. You can find other partners, other opportunities, other ways to get what you need. But this, he gestured vaguely toward the city beyond the terrace, this involves things that can't be replaced if you lose them. It was perhaps the most profound statement Trump had made about international relations since returning to office, and Zelensky recognized it as such. Mr. President, may I share something with you that I learned during my previous career? Trump nodded, genuinely curious about where this conversation was heading. In theater, the most powerful performances come not from dominating the stage, but from understanding that every actor has a role that contributes to the story's success. The leading man who tries to eclipse everyone else usually destroys the entire production. Zelensky paused, allowing the metaphor to settle. Great leaders, like great actors, understand that their strength comes from elevating others, not diminishing them. That's a hell of a way to put it, Trump said, and for the first time that evening, he smiled, not the calculated grin of political necessity, but something approaching genuine warmth. Though I have to ask, if I'm the leading man in this particular production, what role does that make you? Perhaps, Zelensky said thoughtfully, we are co-stars in a drama neither of us wrote, trying to find a way to reach the final act without destroying the theater. The conversation was taking on a philosophical depth that would have surprised anyone who knew either man only through their public personas. Here, away from cameras and advisors and the constant pressure of political positioning. Two of the world's most scrutinized leaders were engaging in the kind of honest dialogue that rarely occurred at the highest levels of international relations. "Volodymyr, let me ask you something directly," Trump said, leaning forward slightly. "What do you actually want from me? Not the official talking points, not the diplomatic language. What do you personally need to happen to consider this crisis resolved?" It was a question that cut through months of formal negotiations and careful diplomatic positioning. Zelensky considered his response carefully, understanding that this moment of candor might represent the most important conversation of his presidency. "I want my children to grow up in a country that exists," he said simply. "I want Ukrainian families to live without fear that their nation will be erased from the map. I want the principle established that borders cannot be redrawn by force in the 21st century." He paused, his voice taking on added intensity. "And I want the leader of the most powerful democracy in history to understand that some things are worth defending even when defending them is inconvenient." Trump was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the words but the complete absence of political calculation in how they were delivered. This was not a negotiating position or an opening bid. It was a statement of core beliefs from a man who had staked everything on those beliefs. "And what," Trump asked slowly, "would you need from me to help make those things happen?" It was the opening Zelensky had been hoping for, though he had not dared to expect it. What happened next would either represent a breakthrough that changed the entire trajectory of the crisis, or a miscalculation that destroyed any possibility of future cooperation. "Mr. President," Zelensky said, his voice carrying a note of determination, "I would like to make you an offer that I think will surprise you." Trump's eyebrows rose slightly. In 4 decades of high-stakes negotiations, he thought he had heard every possible approach, every conceivable angle. "I'm listening. I want you to become the primary mediator in peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant sound of late-night traffic seemed unnaturally loud. Trump stared at Zelensky with an expression of genuine astonishment. This was not just unexpected, it was the complete opposite of what any rational political analysis would have predicted. "You want me to what?" Trump asked, certain he must have misunderstood. "You heard correctly," Zelensky replied calmly. "I want the United States, under your leadership, to serve as the primary mediator in comprehensive peace negotiations, not as a participant with predetermined outcomes, but as an honest broker committed to finding a sustainable solution that respects the legitimate interests of all parties." Trump's mind was racing through the implications, the opportunities, and the risks of such an arrangement. "Volodymyr, 12 hours ago, I publicly excluded you from the main negotiations. Why in the world would you trust me to mediate anything?" "Because," Zelensky said with a slight smile, "you excluded me when you thought I was weak. Tonight, you applauded when I proved I was strong." A leader who can recognize and acknowledge strength in others is exactly the kind of mediator this situation requires. It was a masterful psychological maneuver, appealing simultaneously to Trump's ego, his desire for historical significance, and his deep-seated respect for displays of power. But more than that, it was a genuine offer based on a clear-eyed assessment of political realities. "Besides," Zelensky continued, "you have something that no other potential mediator possesses: the ability to speak to Russia from a position of strength while maintaining credibility with European allies. Moscow respects your willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. Europe trusts your commitment to democratic values, even when they disagree with your methods." Trump was silent for nearly a minute, weighing the proposal from every conceivable angle. The political benefits were obvious. Successfully mediating a resolution to Europe's most dangerous crisis would secure his historical legacy in ways that domestic policy victories never could. But beyond the political calculations, something else was at work: a growing respect for the man who had just offered him the most significant opportunity of his presidency. "What exactly would you need from me as mediator?" Trump asked, his tone indicating genuine consideration rather than polite dismissal. "Fairness," Zelensky replied immediately. "Not agreement with every Ukrainian position, but a commitment to evaluating all proposals based on their merits rather than their convenience. Russia has had mediators who were sympathetic to their perspective. Ukraine has had mediators who supported our cause. What we have never had is a mediator strong enough to tell both sides when they are being unreasonable." "And you think him that mediator?" "Mr. President," You just spent an entire evening demonstrating that you are willing to make unpopular decisions when you believe they serve a larger purpose. That is exactly what effective mediation requires. Trump stood and walked to the terrace's edge, looking out over the Hague's nighttime skyline. The city below represented centuries of international law, diplomatic tradition, and the gradual development of mechanisms for resolving conflicts between nations. Tomorrow, he would either continue operating outside those traditions, or he would become one of their most unlikely champions. Volodymyr, he said finally, turning back to face the Ukrainian president, if I agree to this, and I'm not saying I am, but if I do, what guarantees can you provide that Ukraine will accept the results of mediation, even if they're not everything you want? The same guarantee I hope you would demand from Russia, Zelensky replied. That we will accept any agreement that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty, provides genuine security guarantees, and establishes a framework for peaceful coexistence. What we cannot accept is any agreement that legitimizes territorial conquest or establishes the principle that democratic nations must submit to authoritarian demands. It was a careful balance, flexibility on details, firmness on principles. Trump recognized the approach because it mirrored his own negotiating style, albeit applied to fundamentally different values. And if Russia refuses reasonable terms, then the world will see clearly who is committed to peace and who is committed to conquest, Zelensky said. Sometimes the most valuable outcome of failed negotiations is moral clarity about who bears responsibility for their failure. Trump walked back to his chair and sat down heavily, the weight of the decision clearly visible in his posture. You realize what you're asking me to do, don't you? You're asking me to potentially spend months, maybe years, invested in an outcome that might not be achievable. Mr. President, Zelensky said quietly, I am asking you to help save my country. But I am also offering you the chance to demonstrate that American leadership can solve problems that have challenged the international community for years. That is not a small legacy to leave behind. The appeal to both moral responsibility and historical significance was perfectly calibrated. Trump understood he was being offered something unprecedented, the chance to broker a peace that would reshape European security, demonstrate American indispensability, and potentially earn him recognition as one of history's most consequential peacemakers. Volodymyr, Trump said slowly, I think you might be the most effective negotiator I've ever encountered. I had an excellent teacher, Zelensky replied with a slight smile. 3 years of crisis diplomacy provide intensive education in the art of persuasion. Trump laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that carried across the moonlit terrace. All right, here's what I'm thinking. Tomorrow morning, instead of proceeding with the NATO sessions as planned, I announced that the United States is prepared to host comprehensive peace negotiations, with me serving as mediator. We give both sides 2 weeks to prepare their positions. Then we convene talks in a neutral location, maybe Switzerland, maybe here in The Hague, and we see if we can actually solve this thing. Mr. President, that would be. Zelensky paused, clearly moved by the magnitude of what was being offered. That would represent a genuine chance for peace. But, Trump continued, raising a finger in warning, this only works if both sides come prepared to make real compromises. I won't waste time on symbolic gestures or political theater. This would be serious negotiations aimed at serious solutions. Understood completely. Trump stood and extended his hand. Then we have an agreement, Mr. President. Partners in trying to end this crisis once and for all. Zelensky rose and grasped Trump's hand firmly. The handshake lasted longer than diplomatic protocol typically required, but both men understood they were sealing more than just a tactical alliance. They were committing to a partnership that would define their legacies and potentially reshape the geopolitical landscape of Europe. Donald, Zelensky said, using Trump's first name for the first time that evening. Thank you for listening when you could have simply dismissed. Volodymyr, Trump replied, matching the personal tone. Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the strongest position is the one that elevates everyone involved. As they walked back toward the Peace Center's main building, both men understood that the evening had fundamentally altered not just their relationship, but the entire trajectory of the crisis that had brought them together. Tomorrow's headlines would announce not just a surprising partnership, but a completely new approach to one of the world's most intractable conflicts. The chess game had concluded with an outcome neither player had anticipated, not victory for one side, but a recognition that the most complex challenges require the strongest leaders to work together. In the world of international relations, where zero-sum thinking typically dominated, two men had discovered that sometimes the greatest power came from sharing it. The moon continued to shine down on The Hague as history quietly rewrote itself on a peaceful terrace, one honest conversation at a time.